Hello, dear viewers of my channel. I'm glad to see you all. Today, we will talk about the Battle of Midway. Enjoy watching. When, in the early summer of 1942, a cloud arose over the Pacific Ocean that no one could quite describe, the very air seemed soaked with the expectation of a decisive clash. For many on the shores of the Hawaiian Islands and at distant Pacific bases, the notion of a turning point still sounded formal, but in the hearts of sailors and pilots it was felt that something greater than a series of separate battles lay ahead. And so it happened. In the first days of June unfolded a battle that proved pivotal, the Battle of Midway. On the American side, the supreme commander in the Pacific was Admiral Chester William Nimitz. Directly to the Midway area, in response to Japanese plans, he concentrated two carrier task forces, one under the command of Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance and the second under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. These figures and their staffs in the coming days proved key in making fateful decisions. The opponent was the Imperial Japanese Naval Aviation, and the top naval commanders, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, stood behind the strategic conception, and the direct commander of the strike carrier force, Kido Butai, was Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. The Japanese echelon included four large carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, with hundreds of aircraft, as well as escort cruisers, destroyers, and auxiliary forces. The Japanese command intended to seize Midway, draw the American fleet into an unfavorable position, and strike it with a blow that would break U.S. resistance in the Pacific. One of the decisive factors in the run-up to the battle was American intelligence. The code-breaking section at Pearl Harbor under Commander Joseph Rochefort managed to recognize that the Japanese were preparing an operation against Island Sea, and with high probability this was Midway. This intelligence preparation gave Nimitz the chance to set an ambush. The Americans knew in advance where to look for the enemy and could position their forces in the right places. Without that code-breaking effort, much could have gone differently. In terms of hardware and numbers, Midway was a clash of carriers and air groups. At the moment of tactical contact, the Japanese had four carriers with roughly 240 aircraft in their air groups, while the Americans on the line of the first strike had three carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, Yorktown, and somewhere from about 150 to 300 aircraft in total, according to various reports. Precise counts vary, but one thing is clear. The Japanese striking force was considerable by aircraft numbers, and both sides put forward their best-trained strike groups. There was also substantial escort at sea, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, but the decisive role was played by carrier aircraft. On June 4, 1942, the early morning began intensely. First, Japanese planes attacked Midway Base. Airfields, seaplanes, depots, and ground posts were targets of the raid. The attacks caused damage but did not completely put the base out of action. That same day, almost as a counterstroke, American carrier and land-based aircraft, pilots from Enterprise, Hornet, and from Midway, rushed to search for the Japanese strike force. At the critical moment, dive bombers, the Douglas SBD Dauntless, appeared over the enemy formation, and their dives resembled stone hammers sent from the sky into the very hearts of the Japanese carriers. It was these raids, carried out by American air groups at a single moment, that turned the course of the battle. The key was how the sequence formed. Torpedo and torpedo bomber squadrons, attacking at low altitude, suffered catastrophic losses to anti-aircraft and fighter fire and from Zero squadrons, but they distracted the Japanese carrier fighters and created a window for the dive bombers' approach. The American dive bombers arrived to strike at the very moment when the Japanese were switching torpedo bombs for spare loads or when their hangars were crowded with burning machines, and this caused explosions and fires on Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Later, aircraft from Yorktown and Enterprise finished off Hiryu, and by the end of the day, 4 Japanese carriers had been destroyed. This episode became the decisive, precise if bloody, drama of the fight. For Japanese sailors and officers, the scene when American dive bombers suddenly appeared over their decks and began their dives was a shock. Many post-war memoirs of Imperial Navy veterans note that at that moment, the faces and voices of people showed not so much fear as panic and the realization, the loss of initiative. Japan had counted on a combination of surprise and superiority in the training of strike groups. When strikes began to inflict decisive damage, they felt not only material losses, but also psychological vulnerability. Americans, by contrast, in their memoirs, spoke of a mixture of horror and exultation. Horror at the losses of their torpedo squadrons, which were almost wiped out, and exultation because that sacrifice opened the path to the destruction of 4 Japanese carriers. One U.S. Navy document noted that the contribution paid for in human lives by individual squadrons was decisive. These conflicting feelings, anxiety among the Japanese and bitter joy among the Americans, make up the emotional fabric of the battle. During the fight, Admiral Nagumo made decisions that historians later debated at length. When the first Japanese carrier aircraft returned from a successful strike and some of their planes required rearming or refueling, Nagumo ordered part of the armament to be reloaded on board, a maneuver that for a short time left the Japanese flight decks vulnerable. In that interval, American dive bomber groups appeared over the formation, and that synchronization proved fatal for the Japanese carriers. The commander entrusted execution to priorities that ultimately worked against him. Rapid rearming and preparation for the next strike delayed the moment of defense. This is a classic example of how tactical decisions in chaotic conditions can have strategic consequences.
As a result of the battle, the Japanese lost 4 of their largest carriers, an important cruiser, and about 2,500 to 3,000 people killed. Roughly 290 to 300 aircraft were destroyed. Figures from different sources fall within this range. The U.S. lost the carrier Yorktown. It was heavily damaged, later finished off by submarine attack and lost. 1 destroyer and approximately 150 aircraft. American human losses were about 300 people. Altogether, this meant that Japan lost the core of its striking air power and a huge reserve of trained crews, which then heavily affected its capabilities in a prolonged naval war. Why did Midway become the turning point? Because war is not only about sinking ships, it is about the ability to reproduce people, aircraft, and technology. The United States had the industrial base and human resources that allowed it to literally forge new air groups and ships. Japan could conduct a successful campaign in the early months, but it could not reproduce experienced pilots or operate at the same level of production capacity. The loss of 4 carriers and hundreds of experienced pilots at Midway meant that Japan lost tempo, initiative, and key human capital, and that is why Midway is commonly called the turning point in the Pacific War. In sunny hours, the sea glitters, and suddenly the horizon fills with comets, planes, smoke, explosions. Sirens wail on the decks, engineers shout, thousands of people run to positions, gunners take aim, smoke blends with sea salt. For those who stood at the vents and watched, it was a mix of mechanics and chaos, an iron orchestra of engine roar, the rustle of fuel hoses, the whine of shredded propellers, and the cries of the wounded. From time to time, urban legends surface about teen pilots saying goodbye to the world, about sailors rushing to put out fires out of fraternal feeling, about those who hoped one victory would be enough, but one victory did not decide the fate of the war. These details create the atmosphere conveyed by veterans' memories. Midway is not only about who shot better, it is a story of intelligence and code-breaking, of tactics and chance, of courage and loss. For the Japanese, it was a bitter lesson. You cannot count on a long war if your strategy depends on a single window of opportunity. For the Americans, it was a touchstone. A country, not long before only partially involved in the World War, found within itself the ability not only to respond, but to turn the game in its favor. In veterans' recollections on both sides, there's recognition. Midway became the moment when commanders understood the value of human life, the cost of risk, and the cost of error. And, decades later, we understand how complex that naval chess match was.